A white millionaire's wife was thrown out after giving birth to twins, one white and one black. Years later, her husband burst into tears when he saw. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the delivery room, cutting through the rising tension like a faint warning. Outside, the hospital hummed with life, nurses hurrying past, carts squeaking down the hallways, and the distant chime of announcements echoing through the PA system. But inside, the world was narrowing, focusing on Kathleen's labored breathing and Harold's trembling grip on her hand. "Breathe, Kathleen," Harold murmured, his voice barely steady. His free hand brushed damp hair from her forehead, but the worry etched into his features betrayed his attempt to appear calm. Kathleen winced, her body tensing with the force of another contraction. I can't." Her voice faltered, swallowed by the weight of pain and exhaustion. "You can," Harold whispered urgently, leaning closer. "You're strong. You're almost there." Dr. Taylor, her tone clipped and professional, glanced up from the foot of the bed. "Kathleen, one more push. You've got this." A guttural scream ripped from Kathleen as her body heaved with one last effort. Then, almost as if the universe had paused to draw a breath, the room was filled with the piercing cry of a newborn. "It's a girl," a nurse announced, lifting the wriggling infant into view. Harold felt an involuntary surge of relief and joy flood his chest as he caught sight of the tiny, squirming life. Tears pricked his eyes, and his lips parted in a whisper. "Annie." But the moment didn't hold. "Wait, there's another," Dr. Taylor interjected, her focus sharpening. "Kathleen, you're not done yet." Another wave of contractions gripped Kathleen, and the room seemed to compress with renewed intensity. Harold felt her hand clench his, her nails biting into his skin. He barely noticed. His focus was glued to her face, to her trembling resolve. Moments later, the second child emerged. Her cries joined the first, but as the nurse lifted the second baby into the sterile air, a sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Harold's smile faltered. The infant's skin, a warm brown, stood in stark contrast to the paleness of her sister. The silence in the room was deafening. "Congratulations," the nurse said hesitantly, glancing between Harold and the babies as if seeking reassurance. Harold's heart stuttered. A cold weight settled in his chest as he stared at the second child. Questions surged, unspoken, but deafening in their clarity. Behind him, the door swung open, and Beverly swept in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Her gaze landed on the newborns, and her expression froze before twisting into a mask of fury. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. Harold turned to face her, words failing him. Beverly stepped forward, her finger stabbing toward the darker-skinned infant. That child is not yours," she declared, her tone slicing through the room. "Harold, you can't honestly believe—" "Mother," he interrupted, his voice strained. "Please." But Beverly wasn't done. Her scornful gaze darted to Kathleen, who lay exhausted but defiant. "You've disgraced this family," she spat. "How dare you bring this shame upon us?" Kathleen's lips trembled, but her voice was steady. "This is your granddaughter," she said, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Both of them are." Beverly barked a bitter laugh. "Granddaughter, you expect me to accept this proof of your betrayal? Stop it!" Harold's voice cracked as he stepped between them, his hands raised in a futile gesture of control. His head pounded, the joy of moments earlier, now a distant memory, replaced by a storm of emotions, confusion, anger, guilt. "Harold," Beverly said, her voice softer now but no less cutting. "You know what this will do to our family name. People will talk. They'll call us fools. You must send her away, both of them." His gaze darted to Kathleen, her tear-streaked face filled with hurt. And something else. Betrayal. The weight of Beverly's words pressed down on him, suffocating, and for a fleeting, shameful moment, he wished he could escape. "Harold," Beverly pressed, her hand gripping his arm. "Do what's right for this family." Kathleen spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "Harold, please." He couldn't meet her eyes. The knot in his stomach tightened as he reached into his pocket. The necklace he had crafted for her glinted in the fluorescent light as he pressed it into her hand. "Take this," he whispered hoarsely. "Please. Take care of Hallie." Kathleen's tears fell freely now, but she clutched the necklace with trembling fingers. Her gaze lingered on him for a long, agonizing moment before she turned and left, cradling Hallie against her chest. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving a silence heavier than any argument. Harold sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The sound of Annie's soft cries echoed in the room, a reminder of what remained and what had been lost. Beverly stood tall beside him, her expression triumphant. But for Harold, all he felt was the crushing weight of regret. The apartment was silent, save for the muffled hum of traffic outside. Kathleen moved methodically, packing a small suitcase on the worn kitchen table. Her movements were quick, but deliberate, the kind of focus that comes when there's no time to dwell on emotions. Hallie stirred in her bassinet nearby, her tiny cries breaking the oppressive quiet. Kathleen paused, her hand trembling as she tucked a soft blanket around her daughter. "Is this what you wanted, Harold?" Her voice was steady, but her words carried a quiet accusation. She didn't turn to look at him as she spoke, her back to the man standing rigid near the door. "I didn't," Harold began, his words faltering. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting between Kathleen and Beverly, who loomed like a shadow in the corner of the room. "This isn't what I wanted," Beverly scoffed, stepping forward with cruel precision. "What you wanted doesn't matter now, does it? What matters is salvaging what's left of this family's dignity." Kathleen's shoulders stiffened, but she kept packing. A small bundle of baby clothes went into the suitcase, followed by a frayed book she'd read aloud to Hallie on sleepless nights. The ordinary items seemed to mock the extraordinary situation she was being forced into. "Stop, Mother," Harold said, his voice low, almost pleading. "You've done enough." "Done enough?" Beverly snapped, her eyes narrowing. "I'm cleaning up your mess, Harold. Do you think the world won't notice? Do you think they won't whisper about the Anderson name being dragged through the mud?" Kathleen turned then, her gaze sharp but calm. "You think this is about your name? You think Hallie, my child, is some blemish to be erased?" Her voice didn't rise, but the words hit like stones. "You can call this whatever you want, Beverly, shame, betrayal. But the truth is, you're just a bitter woman who's forgotten what love looks like." Beverly's face hardened, but before she could reply, Harold stepped between them. His hands rose defensively, though they shook with the effort. "Enough," he said, though the authority in his tone was weak. His eyes met Kathleen's, and the weight of his failure settled in his chest like a stone. "Kathleen." "Please." "Please what, Harold?" Kathleen's voice cracked, though she fought to keep it steady. "Please understand why you're letting her do this. Please forgive you for not standing by your family." His mouth opened, but no words came. He couldn't defend himself, not in the face of her truth. The truth he'd tried to ignore since that moment in the hospital when his world had unraveled. Hallie let out a soft wail from her bassinet, breaking the stalemate. Kathleen crossed the room, her hand brushing the infant's cheek as she whispered soothing words. Harold's eyes followed her, lingering on Hallie, whose dark skin felt like a mirror, reflecting all his doubts, his failures, and his weakness. "I didn't ask for this," he finally said, his voice hollow. "I didn't ask for any of this." Kathleen straightened, cradling Hallie against her chest. Her expression softened, though the pain didn't leave her eyes. "Neither did I, Harold. But here we are." She walked past him to the door, the suitcase in her free hand. Harold moved instinctively, blocking her path. His breath hitched as he fumbled in his pocket, pulling out the necklace he'd given her on their anniversary years ago. The gold chain glinted faintly in the dim light as he pressed it into her palm. "For Hallie," he said, his voice barely audible. "So she'll have something to remember. Us." Kathleen's hand closed around the necklace, her fingers trembling. She didn't say anything, but the way her lips pressed together told him everything. She would take it, but it wouldn't undo what he'd done. Beverly cleared her throat sharply, breaking the moment. "Well, if this melodrama is over, enough!" Harold's voice cracked like a whip, startling even himself. He turned to Beverly, his jaw clenched. "Leave!" Beverly's eyes widened, but she said nothing, retreating to the far end of the apartment with a disdainful glare. Kathleen adjusted Hallie in her arms, giving Harold one last look. There was no anger in her eyes now, just a quiet sadness, a resignation that spoke louder than words. Then, without another word, she stepped past him, the door closing softly behind her. Harold stood frozen, his hand still outstretched as if trying to grasp something already gone. Beverly's sharp heels clicked as she moved closer, her voice breaking the stillness. This was for the best. But Harold didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the closed door, the echo of Kathleen's footsteps fading into the night. Inside him, the hollow ache deepened, a chasm carved by his inability to hold on to the one thing that mattered most. The Anderson mansion was still, its grand halls filled with a quiet that Harold once found comforting. Now it felt suffocating. The air was heavy, tainted by memories of choices he couldn't undo, words he couldn't take back. The ornate chandelier above the dining table cast long shadows across the room, flickering faintly as the wind outside howled against the windows. Harold sat at the head of the polished oak table, a stack of old documents and weathered letters spread before him. The yellowed papers emitted a faint, musty odor, their edges frayed from decades of neglect. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, rubbing his temples as he tried to focus. These were family records, genealogical maps meticulously maintained by his great-grandfather. They were his last hope for answers. Beverly's voice echoed faintly from another room, sharp and dismissive, as she barked orders at the house staff. Harold ignored her, tuning out the sharpness that had shaped his life for as long as he could remember. His mother's voice was as much a part of this house as the creaking floorboards and the ever-present scent of wood polish. But tonight, he needed silence. His fingers brushed against the corner of a fragile envelope, the faded ink barely legible. It was addressed to "My dearest Helena," in a careful, sloping script. A sense of unease and curiosity bubbled within him as he carefully unfolded the letter, revealing the words of a man long gone. "My dearest Helena, the world may never understand us, but our love is stronger than their hate. They see only what divides us, my fair skin, your dark hands. But we know the truth. Our hearts are bound by something far greater than the narrow minds of those who scorn us. I write this so that our children and their children will one day understand. Love is not dictated by the color of our skin, but by the courage to stand together against all odds. Yours forever, Nathaniel." Harold's breath hitched as the words sank in. The truth came sharply into focus, a puzzle piece snapping into place with painful clarity. "Helena," His great-grandmother had been black. The lineage Beverly so proudly claimed, the Anderson name that carried whispers of wealth and distinction, was built on a foundation of mixed heritage. He leaned back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hand. His thoughts were a storm, images of Kathleen and Hallie flashing vividly in his mind. Hallie's deep brown skin, the shape of her eyes. These weren't marks of betrayal. They were echoes of his family's past, a legacy buried beneath years of denial and prejudice. A faint creak pulled his attention, and Beverly stepped into the room, her sharp features bathed in the dim light. She took one look at the scattered documents, and her lips curled into a frown. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her tone clipped. Harold held up the letter, his voice heavy with accusation. "Did you know?" Beverly crossed her arms, her chin lifting in defiance. "Know what?" "That Helena, our great-grandmother, was black," Harold said, his voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "Did you know?" Beverly's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, maybe, or shame. "It doesn't matter," she snapped. "That was generations ago. It's irrelevant." Harold stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Irrelevant," he repeated, his voice rising. "You forced me to send Kathleen and Hallie away. You made me believe—" He stopped, his breath ragged. "You made me doubt my own wife, my own child." Beverly's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "Kathleen was never good enough for this family," she said coldly. "And that child would have ruined us. I did what was necessary to protect you." "Protect me?" Harold's laugh was hollow, bitter. "You didn't protect me. You destroyed my family. You destroyed me." He turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he fought to steady himself. The weight of his guilt pressed harder now, suffocating him. Every memory of Kathleen's tear-filled eyes, Hallie's cries as they left, all of it came crashing down with the force of a tidal wave. "I need to fix this," he muttered, more to himself than to Beverly. Beverly's heels clicked against the floor as she stepped closer. "Fix it," she said sharply. "Don't be ridiculous. What's done is done. You can't undo the past." Harold turned to her, his eyes blazing with a fire she hadn't seen in years. "Maybe I can't undo it," he said, his voice low but firm, "but I can make it right." Beverly opened her mouth to argue, but Harold didn't wait to hear it. He stormed out of the room, the letter still clutched tightly in his hand. For the first time in months, maybe years, his path felt clear. As he ascended the staircase to his study, determination replaced the numbness that had gripped him since the night Kathleen left. He didn't know how he would find them, or if they would even let him back into their lives, but he had to try, for Kathleen, for Hallie, for the family he had failed to protect. Harold stood by the large bay window in his study, staring out at the sprawling gardens of the Anderson estate. The sunset painted the horizon in muted tones of orange and grey, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in the ache of guilt and the faint glimmer of hope that had pushed him to act. He had hired private investigators weeks ago, men who promised discretion and results. Their task was clear: find Kathleen and Hallie. They had scoured cities, followed whispers, and chased fleeting leads, or so Harold was told. But every report they returned with bore the same message: no trace of Kathleen, no sign of Hallie. "It's as if they vanished, sir," one investigator had told him over the phone that morning. Harold's grip on the receiver had tightened at the words. Something about the man's tone felt too rehearsed, too final, as if they'd given up before they'd truly begun. Unbeknownst to Harold, Beverly had been working quietly behind the scenes. She wasn't one to leave loose ends. A well-placed bribe here, a veiled threat there, and the investigators knew better than to dig too deeply. To Beverly, This was simply another step in preserving the family's name, a name she refused to let be tarnished by a child she refused to accept. Harold hung up the phone with a heavy sigh, the weight of failure pressing into his chest. He turned back to the window, the sinking sun casting long shadows across his face. Somewhere out there, Kathleen and Hallie were building a life without him. The town of Middlebury, Vermont, was as unassuming as the hills that surrounded it, charming in its simplicity, but unforgiving in its cold, both in weather and temperament. For Kathleen, it was the only place she could afford to start over. The clapboard house she rented leaned slightly to one side, with peeling white paint that revealed years of neglect. But it was a roof, and more importantly, it was a sanctuary. Inside, the air carried a faint chill even in spring, though Kathleen hardly noticed. Her mornings started before sunrise, dressing Hallie in layers to combat the brisk air, before carrying her to the local diner where Kathleen worked as a waitress. Balancing plates of eggs and steaming coffee pots, Kathleen navigated the clatter and chaos of the breakfast rush with a practiced smile. The regulars rarely tipped more than a few crumpled bills, but she didn't mind. Every dollar went to Hallie. By the time her second shift at the grocery store ended, Kathleen was exhausted. Yet, as she pushed open the door to their little house, the sight of Hallie toddling on unsteady legs made the ache in her back feel distant. "Mama!" Hallie squealed, her tiny hands waving for Kathleen to pick her up. Her big brown eyes sparkled, the same eyes that once made strangers pause to whisper. Kathleen scooped her up, ignoring the way her shoulders protested. "Did you miss me, sweet pea?" she murmured, pressing a kiss to Hallie's soft curls. Hallie nodded, her tiny hands tugging at the chain around Kathleen's neck. The gold necklace, a reminder of Harold, glinted in the dim light. It was all Kathleen had left of the life she once thought would last forever. Dinner was a modest affair, a pot of beans and rice that simmered quietly on the stove as Hallie played with a battered toy truck. Kathleen leaned against the counter, watching her daughter with a mix of pride and exhaustion. But even here, in this quiet town, there were whispers. At the grocery store, women in tailored coats exchanged glances when Hallie babbled in her mother's arms. The old man at the hardware store stared too long, his eyes lingering on Hallie, as though she were an oddity, something he couldn't quite place. Kathleen noticed. And though she kept her head high, there were moments in the dark of night, when Hallie was asleep and the world was silent, that Kathleen let herself cry. Not because she regretted leaving, never that, but because she hated that Hallie might grow up seeing herself as less than whole. One afternoon, as Kathleen rocked Hallie on the porch, the sound of a car backfiring startled her. Hallie flinched, her tiny body pressing into Kathleen's chest. Kathleen held her close, humming a soft tune until Hallie's breathing steadied. "Why do people look at me funny, Mama?" Hallie asked suddenly, her voice curious but unsure, the way only a toddler could sound. Kathleen froze. The question pierced through her like an icy wind. How do you explain prejudice to someone so innocent? She glanced down at Hallie's face, so full of trust, so full of questions. Kathleen shifted Hallie to her lap, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Sweetheart," she began slowly, "sometimes people don't understand things that are different. But, you know what?" Hallie tilted her head, her dark eyes fixed on Kathleen's face. "What?" Kathleen smiled, her voice growing warm. "Different doesn't mean bad. It means special. You and I, we're like this house." She gestured to the worn porch beneath them. "It may not look like much to some people, but it's strong. It keeps us safe. And you, my little Hallie, are the strongest person I know." Hallie giggled, leaning her head against her mother's chest. "I'm strong like the house." Kathleen laughed softly, wrapping her arms tighter around her daughter. "Stronger," she whispered, her voice cracking just slightly. That night, as Kathleen tucked Hallie into bed, she placed the necklace into her daughter's tiny hand for a moment. "This is a piece of your story," she said quietly. "One day, you'll understand how special it makes you." Hallie nodded sleepily, the weight of the day pulling her eyelids shut. Kathleen watched her for a long moment, her heart aching with both love and fierce determination. Their world wasn't easy. It wasn't fair. But as she stood by the window, looking out at the small, silent town, Kathleen made herself a Saukshaya. Promise. "Different doesn't mean broken," she whispered to the night, "and I'll make sure she knows it every single day." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Somewhere far away, Harold might have been searching, but in this little house on the edge of Vermont, Kathleen wasn't waiting. She was building a life, one brick at a time, for the only thing that mattered now, Hallie. The Anderson mansion exuded grandeur, its marble floors and towering columns a testament to wealth and legacy. Yet for Annie, it was a lonely fortress. The sprawling halls and perfectly curated rooms seemed cold, devoid of the warmth she only dimly remembered from the blurry early years of her life. Her memories of her mother were shadows, soft hands, a gentle laugh, the scent of lavender that lingered in the air. Now, her world was shaped by the strict rules and steely presence of Beverly Anderson. "Sit up straight, Annie." Beverly's voice snapped like a whip as Annie hunched over the grand dining table, her fork poised mid-air. The 6-year-old obeyed instantly, her spine stiffening as she adjusted her posture. Beverly observed her with a critical eye before nodding, satisfied. "A proper Anderson doesn't slouch." "Yes, Grandma," Annie murmured, her voice quiet but clear. She had learned early that arguing was pointless. Beverly was a woman of iron principles. She ensured Annie's days were filled with piano lessons, etiquette classes, and hours of academic study. Mistakes were met with stern corrections, though never outright cruelty. Beverly was not unkind, but her affection was hidden, wrapped tightly in her obsession with perfection. There were fleeting moments when her gaze softened, like when Annie played a flawless piece on the piano, or recited poetry with conviction. In those rare instances, Beverly would pat Annie's head and murmur, "Good girl," and Annie would bask in the faint glow of her approval. But there was a shadow in the house that neither discipline nor achievement could banish. It lived in the weary eyes of Harold, who drifted through their days like a ghost. He was kind to Annie, in a quiet, distant way. He would ask about her lessons, listen to her stories, and smile faintly when she handed him a drawing or a flower she had picked. Yet there was a sorrow in his voice that Annie couldn't understand, a weight he carried that she was too young to name. "Why is Papa so sad?" Annie asked one evening, her small frame curled in an armchair as Beverly read beside her. Beverly stiffened, but didn't look up from her book. "Your father has a lot of responsibilities," she said curtly. "Running the Anderson estate isn't easy." Annie frowned. "But he doesn't talk about work. He just sits by the window." "That's enough, Annie," Beverly interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You have your piano practice to finish." Annie didn't ask again, but the question lingered in her mind, unanswered. Harold's sorrow, however, seeped into their interactions in ways he didn't intend. When he tucked Annie in at night, he would linger by her bedside, his hand brushing her hair as he whispered, "Good night, my darling." There was always a tremor in his voice, as if he were apologizing for something Annie couldn't understand. In those quiet moments, Annie often felt the void most acutely. She didn't know the truth. She didn't know the names Kathleen or Hallie, but she sensed the absence of something, or someone, who should have been there. It was an ache she couldn't articulate, a missing piece she didn't know how to name. Beverly filled the silence with discipline, shaping Annie into the image of an Anderson heir. Harold filled it with quiet guilt, offering gentle smiles and fleeting moments of affection that only hinted at the depth of his regret. And Annie grew up in the shadow of both, striving to meet Beverly's expectations while yearning for the warmth she sensed her father could not give. As the years passed, Annie learned to navigate the rules of the Anderson household. She excelled in her studies, played piano with precision, and carried herself with the grace Beverly demanded. Yet, in the stillness of her room at night, she would lie awake staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. There was no way for Annie to know that her father's sadness was rooted in the loss of a family she had never met, a mother and sister who lived only in Harold's haunted memories. But even in her innocence, Annie felt the weight of that loss, an unspoken truth that shaped her world without her ever understanding its origin. The campus of Cornell University was alive with energy, students rushing between classes, their conversations weaving a tapestry of ideas and ambitions. Among them, Annie moved with poise, her upbringing evident in her graceful demeanor and polished speech. Her new semester had been challenging but invigorating, and the university's thriving social justice scene had drawn her in immediately. It was at one of these meetings, held in a sunlit room in the campus's community center, that Annie first saw Hallie. The group was small, 15 students sitting in a loose circle, exchanging ideas about an upcoming project to support underprivileged youth in the city. Annie had spoken confidently about funding strategies when Hallie entered, slightly out of breath, but smiling warmly. She apologized for being late, her tone easy and confident. Annie found herself watching the newcomer with curiosity. There was something magnetic about Hallie, her sharp intelligence, the way she spoke with conviction, and the quiet strength she exuded. Her deep brown skin and natural curls framed a face that was both striking and kind. As the meeting ended and students began to disperse, Hallie approached Annie. "You had some great points in there," she said, her smile widening. Annie returned the smile. "Thanks. You're new to the group?" Hallie nodded. "Yeah, just transferred this semester. Thought I'd jump in." She extended a hand. "I'm Hallie." "Annie," she replied, shaking Hallie's hand. Their connection was instant. They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation as they walked toward the library together. Both were passionate about community work, and they quickly discovered shared values in their desire to make meaningful change. The next day, the lecture hall buzzed with energy as students filed in, shuffling to claim their seats. Annie adjusted her bag on the desk and scanned the room, her gaze landing on a girl with dark, coiled hair sitting a few rows away. "She's Hallie, the girl yesterday." Her vibrant presence seemed to fill the space around her, from her easy smile to the way she animatedly gestured during conversation. As the professor began the lecture on systemic inequality in urban housing, Annie found herself glancing at the girl again. Something about her seemed familiar, though Annie couldn't place why. It wasn't until the class ended and students began filing out that she found herself walking beside the stranger. "Hey," Annie ventured, her tone warm but hesitant. The girl turned, her smile widening. "Hi, Annie." Their names hung in the air for a beat, and then they both chuckled. "Well, that's not confusing at all," Hallie said with a grin. "Not at all," Annie replied, laughing. "Do you have a minute? I'd love to grab coffee and talk more about what we covered in class." Hallie nodded. "Sure. That was intense, right? I'm all for untangling it over caffeine." At the campus cafe, the conversation flowed easily. Hallie spoke passionately about her work with a local non-profit focused on affordable housing. Her words carried a confidence and depth that struck Annie. There was a rawness to Hallie's experiences, a perspective shaped by struggle that Annie, with her sheltered upbringing, found herself captivated by. "I guess my mum's a big part of why I do what I do," Hallie said, her fingers idly playing with a delicate gold necklace around her neck. She worked herself to the bone to make sure I knew I was more than what people thought of me. Annie's gaze lingered on the necklace, intrigued by its simple beauty, and the way Hallie's touch seemed reverent. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "Is it hers?" Hallie nodded. "She gave it to me before she passed, said it was part of my story." Her voice softened, and for a moment her usual energy dimmed. "I wear it every day so I don't forget." Annie reached across the table instinctively, her hand brushing Hallie's. "She sounds amazing." Hallie smiled, the sadness lifting slightly. "She was. And she never let me think being different was a negative thing." Their conversation turned, and soon Hallie asked, "What about you? You seem like you've got it all together. What brought you to social justice?" Annie hesitated, unsure how to articulate her answer. "My dad, I guess," she said finally. "He's always been this kind, quiet person. But there's a sadness in him. I think part of me wants to understand why, and helping others feels like a way to do that." Hallie tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's heavy. Do you think he'll ever talk about it?" "I don't know," Annie admitted, "but I hope so." As the cafe emptied and the sun dipped lower, Annie glanced at her watch. "Hey, you should come to dinner at my house," she said impulsively. "My dad would love to meet you, and I'd love to keep this conversation going." Hallie looked surprised, but pleased. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be. Please, it's the least I can do after you shared so much." Hallie hesitated only briefly before nodding. "All right, dinner sounds great." As they parted ways, Annie's mind buzzed with anticipation. She couldn't have known how significant her invitation would prove to be. Nor could Hallie have guessed how her story and her necklace were about to collide with a past neither of them knew they shared. We are curious to know which child you are listening to this story. Share this in the comments. Every family story is so lovely. Now, let's continue. The Anderson mansion had changed since Beverly's passing 3 years prior. The air, once charged with her domineering presence, now felt heavy with absence. Harold, no longer hemmed in by his mother's expectations, wandered its grand halls like a shadow. Without Beverly's relentless discipline, the house had softened into an uneasy quiet, though its grandeur still loomed, a shell of a home weighed down by memories and regret. The dinner table, a sprawling piece of polished mahogany, was set impeccably for 3. Harold sat at the head, his hands folded in front of him, staring at the flickering candlelight as if lost in its depths. Annie's cheerful voice filtered in from the foyer as she greeted her guest, her tone warm and excited. "Dad, this is Hallie," Annie said as she entered, leading a young woman into the room. Harold rose, a polite but distracted smile on his face. The sight of Hallie startled him. Her name, her striking features, the confident way she carried herself, and the unmistakable necklace that glinted softly against her chest. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as his gaze lingered on the delicate chain. "Hallie, this is my dad," Annie said, beaming. "Mr. Anderson, it's so nice to meet you," Hallie said, extending her hand. Her voice was smooth and steady, but her expression softened when Harold's hesitant grip met hers. "Welcome," he managed, his throat tightening. The 3 sat, and Annie filled the silence with animated conversation. She spoke about their shared classes, the campus project they were working on, and how Hallie's insight had been invaluable. Hallie, though initially reserved, began to open up. She spoke about her childhood, her late mother and the challenges they'd faced. Harold listened intently, his mind spinning with questions he dared not ask aloud. "She always told me I was special," Hallie said, her fingers brushing the necklace absent-mindedly. "She said this necklace carried part of our story, though she never really explained what she meant. It's all I have of her now." Harold's breath caught. The necklace. It was unmistakable. The intricate detailing, the delicate clasp. He had chosen it for Kathleen all those years ago. He swallowed hard, his hands tightening around his napkin under the table. "That's a beautiful piece," he said, his voice strained. Hallie glanced down at it, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks. It's my most treasured thing." Harold's gaze flickered to Annie, who was listening intently. She had no idea what was unfolding in his mind, the storm of realization crashing against years of grief and regret. Could this young woman sitting across from him be Hallie? His Hallie? As the evening wore on, Harold's questions grew louder in his mind. Every detail Hallie shared, the struggles of her mother, the way she spoke about resilience and love, fit too perfectly. Yet, he said nothing, fear and hope tangling in his chest. After dessert, Annie excused herself to retrieve a book she wanted to show Hallie. The moment she left the room, the air grew heavier. "Hallie," Harold began, his voice careful. "Your mother. She must have been a remarkable woman." Hallie looked at him, her expression softening. "She was. She raised me on her own and gave me everything she could. I only wish she were still here to see me now." Harold hesitated, his words catching in his throat. Before he could say more, Annie returned, her energy breaking the tension. "Hallie, you'll love this book. It's all about the impact of housing policies on marginalized communities," Annie said enthusiastically. Hallie smiled, taking the book and flipping through its pages. Later that evening, after the girls had said their goodbyes and Hallie left with promises to visit again, Harold retreated to his study. The house, now quiet once more, seemed to press in on him. He quietly went down to the living room, picking up the cup Hallie had drunk from before the maid came to clear it away. It was the only piece of evidence, the only thing that made his life less heavy. Harold clutched the cup, his mind racing. The resemblance, the necklace, the stories Hallie had shared. It couldn't be a coincidence. His heart pounded at the possibility. He reached for the phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "This is Harold Anderson," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need a DNA test done." Quietly. As the call ended, Harold leaned back in his chair, the weight of his decision settling over him. If his suspicions were correct, the girl who had sat at his table tonight wasn't just a guest. She was his daughter. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Harold sat alone in his study, a sealed envelope resting on the desk before him. The DNA test results had arrived earlier that morning, delivered by a courier who didn't linger. For hours, Harold had stared at the envelope, the possibilities swirling in his mind like a storm. Finally, he tore it open, his hands trembling. The words jumped off the page. Parent-child relationship, 99.9% probability. Harold's breath caught in his throat. It was true. Hallie was his daughter. Relief and dread tangled within him, his thoughts immediately turning to Kathleen. He had failed her, failed both of them. A note attached to the report confirmed his worst fear. Kathleen had passed away 2 years earlier. The weight of it all threatened to crush him. Yet, as the initial wave of despair receded, a new resolve rose in its place. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to mend the future. Later that evening, Harold called both Annie and Hallie to his home, insisting it was important. The dining room was prepared, though far less formal than usual. Annie arrived first, her cheerful chatter filling the space as always, but Harold's strained smile didn't go unnoticed. "Dad, are you okay?" Annie asked, her brow furrowing. "Just a lot on my mind," Harold replied, brushing off the question. When Hallie arrived, the tension in the room seemed to double. She greeted them warmly, unaware of the emotional minefield she had just entered. Dinner began with polite conversation, Annie leading most of it as she recounted stories from campus. Harold contributed sparingly, his eyes flicking toward Hallie more often than not. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, Harold set his fork down and cleared his throat. "Hallie," he began, his voice low but steady. "There's something I need to tell you. Both of you." Annie stopped mid-sentence, her eyes darting between her father and Hallie. "Okay," Hallie said cautiously, her posture stiffening. Harold hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on him. "Hallie, the necklace you wear, I recognize it." Hallie blinked, her fingers instinctively brushing the pendant. "You do?" He nodded. "I gave it to your mother many years ago." Confusion flickered across Hallie's face. "My mother? But how?" Harold took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "Hallie, I believe you're my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Annie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to Hallie. Hallie froze, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Harold's voice cracked as he pressed on. "I didn't know until recently. I ran a DNA test after you came to dinner the other night. The results confirm it. You're my daughter." Hallie's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, her hands clenched at her sides. "This has to be some kind of joke," she said, her voice rising. "You can't just—" "What?" "Decide I'm your daughter out of nowhere." "It's not out of nowhere," Harold said, his tone desperate. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. Your mother, Kathleen, He faltered, his hands shaking. "She was my wife, but I let her go. I let both of you go, and I've regretted it every day since." Hallie stared at him, her eyes blazing. "You let us go?" she repeated, her voice dripping with anger. "You're telling me that you abandoned us, that my mother had to raise me alone because of you." "Hallie, please," Harold pleaded, standing as if to approach her. "I didn't know how to fix it. I was weak, and I listened to the wrong people. "Stop," Hallie interrupted, her voice shaking. "You don't get to make excuses. My mother worked herself to death to give me a life, and you were here, in this mansion, doing what? Feeling sorry for yourself?" "Hallie," Annie interjected softly, reaching out a hand, but Hallie pulled away, her breaths coming fast and shallow. "I can't do this," Hallie said, stepping back. "I can't be here." "Hallie, wait," Harold begged, his voice breaking. But Hallie was already heading for the door. She paused briefly, her back to them, before turning slightly. "She deserved better than you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And then she was gone. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house. Harold sank back into his chair, his face in his hands. Across the table, Annie sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Dad," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Harold looked up, his eyes red and filled with regret. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "And now, I might have lost her for good." The room fell into silence, the weight of the evening pressing down on both of them. Somewhere outside, the faint sound of Hallie's footsteps faded into the night. Hallie wandered aimlessly through the city streets, the cool night air biting at her skin. She clutched her necklace tightly, her mind racing with the revelations from the evening. Her thoughts were a mess of anger, confusion, and a longing she didn't want to admit. The father she'd never known had been right there all along, living in a mansion while her mother had struggled to keep them afloat. She found herself at a park, empty save for the occasional jogger. The soft glow of a street lamp illuminated a lone bench near the lake. Hallie sat down, the tension in her shoulders slowly giving way to exhaustion. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Never let anyone define your worth, Hallie. You're stronger than that." But tonight, she didn't feel strong. The campus was quiet in the early morning light, its usual bustle subdued as students trickled into libraries and lecture halls. Hallie sat on a bench near the quad, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee cup. Her mind churned with the events of the night before, replaying Harold's words over and over. The weight of it all felt unbearable. The sudden revelation of a father she didn't want to claim, the betrayal she couldn't forgive, and the question she was too afraid to ask. She didn't notice Harold's approach until his shadow fell across her. Hallie looked up sharply, her expression hardening as she met his gaze. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone clipped. Harold hesitated, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. His usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. "I came to see you," he said softly. Hallie scoffed, turning away. "You've done enough." "I know," Harold said, his voice faltering. He took a tentative step closer. "But I need you to hear me out. Please." Hallie's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't move to leave. She set her coffee down on the bench beside her and crossed her arms. "Fine. Say whatever you came to say, then leave." Harold lowered himself onto the bench, careful to keep some distance between them. He clasped his hands tightly, his knuckles white. "I don't know where to begin," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I've thought about this moment for years, but now that it's here." Hallie said nothing, her expression unyielding. "I want to tell you about your mother," Harold continued, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Kathleen was extraordinary. She was strong, compassionate, and so full of life. I loved her more than I can ever put into words." He paused, his voice catching. "But I failed her. I failed both of you." Hallie's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "I let fear control me," Harold said, his voice thick with regret. "Fear of my mother's judgment, of losing the life I thought I needed to protect. I was weak, and in my weakness, I hurt the two people I should have protected the most." He finally looked at Hallie, his eyes filled with tears. "You didn't deserve that. Neither did Kathleen. She deserved a partner who stood by her, not someone who let her walk away. And you deserved a father who fought for you, not one who hid behind excuses." Hallie's lips trembled, but she kept her expression hard. "You think saying this makes it better? That it erases the years my mother struggled to give me what you were too afraid to?" "No," Harold said immediately, shaking his head. "I know it doesn't. I know I can never make up for what you lost. But I'm here now, Hallie. I'm here because I want to try, if you'll let me." Hallie turned away, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She wanted to hate him, to dismiss his words and walk away. But something in his voice, his brokenness, his sincerity, made her pause. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I can't let fear rule me anymore," Harold said simply. "Because I lost Kathleen, and I can't lose you too. You're my daughter, Hallie, and I want to be your father, if you'll let me." At that moment Annie appeared, her face flushed from running. "Hallie," she said breathlessly, glancing between them. "I came as soon as Dad told me he was coming here." Hallie stood abruptly, her emotions boiling over. What? Are you here to convince me too? No, Annie said softly, stepping closer. I'm here because I care about you, and because I know how much Dad has regretted everything. He's not perfect, Hallie, but he's trying. Please don't shut him out. Hallie's defenses wavered, her gaze shifting between Harold and Annie. The anger and betrayal she felt were still raw, but beneath them was something else, a flicker of longing she couldn't ignore. Harold rose, his movements slow and tentative. Take your time, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll wait as long as it takes. Just, please know how much I care about you. Hallie stared at him for a long moment, the walls she'd built around her heart trembling. Finally, she turned back to the bench, picking up her coffee. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly. Harold nodded, his expression both painful and hopeful. I understand. As he and Annie stepped away, Hallie remained on the bench, her coffee cooling in her hands. She didn't call them back, but she didn't leave either. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder what it might mean to have a father. The Anderson mansion felt different as Hallie stepped inside, her suitcase trailing behind her. Gone was the overwhelming sense of grandeur she had imagined from her mother's distant descriptions. Instead, the house now seemed quieter, warmer. A place that, though unfamiliar, didn't feel entirely unwelcoming. Harold greeted her with a tentative smile, his movements hesitant, as if afraid one wrong step might send her retreating again. Welcome, he said simply, his voice soft. Hallie nodded, her eyes scanning the polished floors and intricate molding. Thanks, she replied, her tone cautious but not cold. Annie bounded down the staircase, her energy breaking the tension. Hallie, you're here, she exclaimed, wrapping her arms around her half-sister. Hallie stiffened slightly, unaccustomed to such straightforward affection, but she didn't pull away. Just for a little while, Hallie reminded her, don't get too comfortable. Don't worry, Annie teased, her smile bright. You'll be the one getting comfortable soon enough. The first few days were awkward. Meals were punctuated by long silences, Harold struggling to find the right words, and Hallie reluctant to open up. But Annie's presence served as a bridge, her light-hearted chatter and insistence on family movie nights easing some of the tension. One evening after dinner, Harold gathered the courage to approach Hallie in the living room. She was curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when he sat down across from her. I've been thinking, he began, his tone careful, about your mother and how we can honor her memory. Hallie looked up, her expression wary but curious. What do you mean? I know I can never undo the mistakes I made, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. But I want to do something meaningful, something that reflects who she was and the values she lived by. Annie, who had been eavesdropping from the hallway, chimed in. Like a community project. Hallie, didn't you say your mum was passionate about helping people? Hallie hesitated, her fingers grazing the pendant of her necklace. She was, she admitted softly. She always believed in giving back, no matter how little we had. A flicker of warmth crossed Harold's face. Then let's do that. Let's start something in her name. A community initiative to help families in need. Hallie's defenses wavered as she considered the idea. You think that'll fix everything? No, Harold said honestly. But it's a start, and it's something we can do together. Hallie studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right, let's see if you mean it. The following weeks saw the family working together in a way none of them had expected. Hallie's knowledge of non-profit work, combined with Annie's enthusiasm and Harold's resources, created a dynamic that brought them closer. Small moments, a shared laugh over Annie's clumsy attempts at baking, a late-night brainstorming session in the study, chipped away at the walls Hallie had built around herself. One afternoon, while sorting through photos for the initiative's promotional materials, Harold handed Hallie a framed picture of Kathleen. She stared at it, her throat tightening as memories flooded back. "She was incredible," Harold said quietly, his voice filled with reverence. "And you remind me so much of her." Hallie's grip on the frame tightened, her heart aching with both pride and loss. "She deserved better," she said, her voice trembling. "She did," Harold agreed, tears glistening in his eyes. "But I hope I can be better now. For you, and for her memory." For the first time, Hallie saw not the man who had abandoned her, but a father desperately trying to atone. It didn't erase the pain, but it planted a seed of hope. As the initiative took shape, the house transformed. Where once it had been a place of sorrow and silence, it now buzzed with life and purpose. Volunteers filled the halls, laughter echoed from the kitchen, and Harold's once solemn expression softened with the joy of making a difference. One evening, as the three of them sat around the dining table, Annie raised a toast. "To Mom," she said, her voice bright but heartfelt, "and to second chances." Hallie raised her glass hesitantly, her eyes meeting Harold's. "To Mom," she echoed. As their glasses clinked, Harold felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds to heal, conversations to have. But for the first time, he dared to believe that they were on the path to becoming a family. And in the glow of the moment, he silently thanked Kathleen. It was her love and her legacy that had brought them back together, reminding them all that even the deepest wounds could lead to new beginnings. The community center stood proud in the heart of the city, its facade newly painted and adorned with a modest plaque. The Kathleen Anderson Center, a legacy of love and justice. Inside, the rooms buzzed with activity. Volunteers prepared for the launch event, arranging chairs and setting up banners that read, "United against hate and strength in diversity." Harold stood near the stage, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. It had been years since he'd spoken publicly, and today's occasion carried more weight than any boardroom speech he had ever delivered. This was about family, about Kathleen, about making amends. Hallie entered the room, her presence commanding yet humble. She wore a simple dress and her mother's necklace, the gold pendant catching the light. Since deciding to join her father and sister in their mission, Hallie has taken on the role of a public advocate. Her story of resilience, love, and the fight against prejudice had already begun to inspire others. "Ready?" Annie asked, appearing beside her with a clipboard in hand. She had thrown herself into organizing the center's outreach programs, her energy and optimism shining through in every detail. Hallie glanced at Harold, who was nervously pacing near the podium. "He looks like he's about to faint," she said with a faint smile. Annie grinned. "You should have seen him practicing his speech last night. I think he went through a whole box of tissues." The room began to fill, a diverse crowd of community members, activists and friends settling into their seats. Hallie and Annie exchanged a glance before heading to join their father near the stage. When it was time to begin, Annie stepped up first, her bright smile and warm tone instantly putting the audience at ease. She spoke about the center's mission, the importance of creating safe spaces, and the tireless effort it had taken to bring the vision to life. Then it was Hallie's turn. She walked to the podium with quiet confidence, her voice steady as she shared her story. "I grew up not knowing my father," she began, her gaze sweeping the crowd, "and for years I carried anger and questions about why he wasn't there. But I also grew up with a mother who taught me the value of love, resilience, and standing up for what's right. This center is for her, for the strength she gave me, and for the strength we can give each other." The audience erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the room. Finally, Harold stepped forward, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. He took a deep breath, his voice breaking slightly as he began. "I stand here today as a man who has made mistakes, grave ones. I failed my family when they needed me most, and for years I let guilt and fear keep me from trying to make things right." His eyes found Hallie and Annie in the front row, their expressions a mix of pride and emotion. "But my daughters, both of them, taught me that it's never too late to change. That redemption is possible if you're willing to face your mistakes and work to do better." He paused, the room utterly silent. This center isn't just about righting my wrongs. It's about creating a world where no one has to feel less than because of who they are, where love and understanding triumph over hate and fear. And it's about honoring the memory of my wife, Kathleen, whose courage and love brought us here today. Tears glistened in the eyes of many in the audience as Harold stepped back, his speech met with a standing ovation. The rest of the event was a celebration. Workshops, speeches, and stories shared among a vibrant, hopeful crowd. Hallie found herself surrounded by people eager to hear more about her journey, while Annie flitted from group to group, ensuring everything ran smoothly. As the evening drew to a close, Harold joined his daughters by the center's entrance. The three of them stood hand in hand, watching as the last guests departed. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.